Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. We're going to jump right in. This is the first part of the series on Kant's grounding for the metaphysics of morals, Immanuel Kant. This text was published in 1785. Kant was alive from 1724 to 1804, either 79 or 80 when he died. I'm not exactly sure. Um, so you should be able to see on the screen our guiding questions, and and now you should be able to see the Instagram page with answers to the guiding questions. I have updated seven, and the numbers don't match up exactly, but the questions are mostly the same. Seven on the Instagram says, what is the categorical imperative? But the related question, more properly put, with more information that's more helpful, is there are five formulations of the categorical imperative. These five are different ways of saying the same principle that can be put directly into words and only uh, that cannot be put directly into words in only one way. What are the two forms of the categorical imperative related to universal law and end in itself? And so, since I've already named those universal law and end in itself, I'm not asking you just to say that those are you need to tell me what those are, or you need to be able to. Um, that would help you prepare for the exam, or if this is a class structure in which we have weekly exit tickets and you chose to do these guiding questions as the exit ticket, or you were preparing these guiding questions on your own to get ready for the exam, etc. Um, explain what these two formulations in particular emphasize and signify. Also explain how they are derived from other aspects of the argument a priori. So if you were to write the essay on this reading, there's a very intuitive flow in the same order that Kant presents it, and the same order of the guiding questions. Um, you would start pretty much, and the prompt has the list in the same order as well. It says stuff, it's something like explain the relationship between a goodwill, duty, respect, a categorical imperative. And so it's very bare bones, but you would have to then write 900 words about that, or maybe more or less, depending on the class structure and what I've decided is appropriate for that semester. Um, but yeah, the prompts are very simple, but you need to know the material because there's plenty to say about it. Um, so we can start answering those things. What are the categorical imperative? Categorical imperative is basically the golden rule. Treat others how you want to be treated or never take an action. Specifically, it's more technically never take an action that you could not universalize the maxim of for everyone else to take. Meaning, it doesn't tell you to always do things that you want everybody else to do, but it, in the first instance, at least, puts a restriction on what you can do. Um, And these are called negative duties. They're duties that we have not to do things, not to lie, not to kill, not to steal, not to cheat, not to break our word, um, not to be late for things, not to be unfair, not to be unjust, not to be manipulative, not to be abusive. And then there are positive duties too, things we would want everybody to go out of their way to do. And these are more debated. And Kant wrote about these in particular in a different work. He thought that the particular duties would require empirical evidence from psychology or another science. And that's a posteriori, meaning after experience. And so instead of, um, it's over here on the answer to the question, what is enlightenment? Because I taught these texts on the same class day whenever it's in person. It's a very fast class. We're going to take more time on it here. Um, a posteriori means you can think of posterior or post, meaning after. So after experience, and a priori meaning prior, before experience. Um, and for Kant, a grounding for the metaphysics or like some universal justification or some principle that you could use with information from experience must be deduced a priori without any reference to the outside. So that's why question 11 says, what is the difference between a priori and a posteriori? Well, the difference is a priori is prior to experience, and a posteriori is post experience or with an outside world. The distinction really doesn't hold. This is one of those ways in which um, the rationalism empiricism debate is murky because, like we showed, Descartes depended on experience. Spinoza repeatedly said, anybody who's been shown by experience. Um, Descartes said if it could ever turn out that something by which I had perceived something with a natural light turned out to be false, then I would not be able to trust it. Um, he doesn't quite say that. I mean, he's basically using inductive evidence there, unless he's begging the question and just saying, I'm defining this thing this way and it can never be wrong. So he's either begging the question, which I don't think is justified, or he's using experience, which I do think is justified. But it pushes against the a priori, a posteriori distinction. And even in Kant, mental experience is still experience. And that's why he has something that he calls the synthetic a priori, or the space of the mind that does not need the world, or is our, I mean, I think it's better to say is already with the world, is always with the world, unavoidably with the world. There is no priori. Um, but that's not what Kant thought. Kant did make these distinctions. I'm just critical of them. And I haven't read a ton of Kant. He's difficult and he takes a lot of time to process. So, anyway, why is this significant to the definition of a goodwill? A goodwill is what is good without qualification, meaning it cannot reference satisfaction, joy, payoff, desire, inclination, trying to help somebody, any kind of outcome. It's kind of strange to think about. But then what would good be if it didn't reference some goal that it was pursuing for somebody else's good or well-being? It would be the good in itself, or the good intending, or the good desire, not quite desire, because desire has satisfaction. It's something that you will or intend without a culmination that is, Dewey would say that would be aesthetic. So you can't even have aesthetic experience um, in a moral way for Kant. There are some strong contradictions that he comes up against with other thinkers. Um, Whereas with most of our thinkers that we study, I try to be really flexible and interpret them charitably and see how they can work together. I think with Kant, he really doesn't leave us much wiggle room. He does revise his positions later, like the third critique on aesthetics seems to be more flexible and fluid than strictly eidetic and reductive or transcendent, quote unquote. Um, but yeah, again, he's also going to be a transcendentalist. Um, so he's not going to leave room for the world to be immanent itself. There's just a lot I brush up against with when it comes to Kant that I don't like. But I do, um, actually, I do like these two texts that we're reading. I do like, and by like, I mean, I agree with them. I think they're right. Uh, the first one being an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? I thought that had a lot of useful stuff in it. And grounding for the metaphysics of morals, I also think there's a lot of useful stuff in it. So a priori is how he grounds, and the fact that we're not looking for something that can reference experience is how we find a goodwill as our starting point in the argument or in the kind of production of reasoning or truth. And then why is this also significant to the transition from respect, which is just abstract respect for what, to respect for universal law as such, or the universalizability of all my actions? Well, if we need to respect law, he says that the only thing that we can respect is law as such, or because, well, really because what respect is the mental eidetic experience of my own consciousness being subordinated to the universal law, or like universalizability. So I get respect from being dutiful. It's the worth of respect, but it's not a culmination or a fulfillment, and it doesn't give me an ego. It might give me arete or excellence or energy or confidence or stability or harmony or integrity. It probably does give me those things. And we could probably look at Joan Didion's Self-Respect at Source is Power, where she talks about self-respect as an internal calculation that you make with yourself based on what you've been through and what you've suffered and what you how you sleep with yourself at night. Um, but it's a little different for Kant, where you do have this universalizable standard at some point. And yeah, some of the things he says are really surprising. With duty, you can't actually you he explicitly says that the person who does something good for somebody else's sake because they care about them and enjoy like the confelicity or the feeling with of their well-being, like Aristotle says, right? Aristotle says that the most complete happiness involves the happiness of others. And so the most good way of living involves ensuring that everybody in my community has a good life as well and is happy and well. And for Kant, in Kant's moral theory, by the way, this is the second big moral theory out of the three. The three big moral theories in the history of philosophy are Aristotle's virtue ethics, Kant's deontology or universal law, categorical imperative, but also the smaller, finer details of the deontology are duty and respect and goodwill and these eidetic grounds that I think are pretty experiential too. Um, and so we don't want to reduce it to just do unto others as you would have others do unto you. There's certainly far more to deontology than that. And we're not going to do everything in it because it can get pretty complicated. I'm not going to do it to a standard that I would do if I was teaching Moral Philosophy 1, which is like a 3,000 level course. I probably am not yet qualified to teach a course like that. But I can certainly talk about the meta ethics of it. Um, Respect, again, is that subordination of the order of my mind, feeling my mind is under an order that I would want others to follow. Not that I would want others to follow, that would be healthy for everyone to follow. And then I have seen others have to follow. I think that respect comes in there as well. If you're doing it a priori, though, you can't have reference to any of that. So we'll have to try to think carefully at that moment in the text when we're reading it together about what it is exactly that, yes, respect is the experience of myself becoming more organized. Um, just with reference to 2 points. The Let's look at the Instagram. Feeling the consciousness of one's own will, subordinated to and under the organization of the universal natural laws of reason. But without a lot of outside experience of the world, it's hard to see what those universal natural laws of reason are. So I think phenomenologically, what we can say at least is that respect is the transition into a more ordered state, where that more ordered state is feeling the consciousness of one's own will. And then we translate all of that into what this the universal natural laws of reason. We derive the universal natural laws of reason from that feeling of transitioning into a more ordered state. And we assume that this is healthy and natural for others, I guess, because we don't have reference to their lives, because we don't have reference to an outside world. But what is a good will? I'm just going to read these at this point. Good without qualification, intention, drive, disposition, organic, no payoff, no influences in itself. You could say it's a tendency, an impulse. It's probably involves listening. It's probably effortful. It's probably perceptual and not just rampantly active or active is perceptual. Action is perceptual. It's probably not rampantly mechanical in its doing. The term mechanical as one extreme of thoughtless, rote bodily doing is something we'll look at in Dewey. John Dewey's Aesthetics and Art as Experience, where if your experience is too fluid, which is the opposite of mechanicalness, it's just loose and smooth, then there's no meaning or no order. And if there's too much order or too much structure, then there's no breathing and there's no connection between the parts, no significance to the perceptions. So in one case, there's no meaning because there's no difference between the two when it's too smooth. In the other case, there's no meaning because there's no conversation between the two when it's too um, structured or too rigid. And interestingly enough, this brings us back to our two dyads from Deleuze, um, where univocity is ridiculous because it means to say that the being of a tick and the being of a cockroach is the same as the being of God. So there's no difference between the two, the smoothness. And the other extreme, equivocity, where everything is so different that it can't be communicated at all and there's no meaning across. Um, Forgot precisely why I brought this up with relation to tendency and impulse. Instead of happiness, what is the purpose of reason? This is a really interesting point in the text where Kant brings up a word, misology, misology, which is the hatred of reason. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm at least skeptical of a universal reason. And so in one way, because I believe in intuition and like perspectival truths and growth and diversification, because I don't necessarily think it's possible to attain universals or absolutes beyond this embodied perspective, which has lots of particular vantage points, which are partial and incomplete necessarily. I think you run into problems if everybody is universal and always following the duties, which is why I like Aristotle, where reason is something that's embodied and the good decision depends on the actor, depends on a wise actor, who's had lots of practice. Anyway, Kant's, so that's, I don't, the same part of me that hates reason is the same part of me that's skeptical of reason. I don't really hate it. I just, he talks about it as refusing to submit to it. And so he doesn't really talk about it as something like that you resent. I mean, kind of resent it, but I just don't always think it's good. I mean, I genuinely have other convictions about what is appropriate and what is good. Um, and this is, I guess, maybe because I hate it. Maybe because I don't think that reason is good for me if it's something that I hate, which is what Spinoza says too. He says that the good is that which drives us forward and gives us more energy to accomplish our life passions and pursuits, the endeavor, which is pragmatic as well, where pragmatic truth is whatever is a tool for future utility. But we're gonna read his stuff. So because of misology, because of the hatred of reason, we can see that reason's purpose is not to make us happy. And that's probably true even holding everything else I said, because Kant doesn't really consider eudaimonia or happiness as the supreme good. He considers respect, self-respect, and adhering to universal law as the supreme good. He considers the supreme right or duty as good. So he puts right above good. We didn't do the euthyphro in these online classes, but the euthyphro problem in Plato is another good point where you can kind of talk about right versus good. Um, do the gods determine what is right? So does like a kind of cultural tribal good determine law? Or does law tell its people what they should learn to love? Spinoza's actually got kind of a mix of this because there's an enactivistic conception of truth where whatever ends up being good for you is what ends up happening in a process that refines itself globally, where you correct injustices and whatnot. But they're sort of mutually co-determining in Spinoza's system, the right and the good. Whereas in Kant, um, the right definitely has priority. There's absolutely zero respect or tolerance for selfishness or self-interest or pleasure or personal good or personal satisfaction. There's similarly very little tolerance for self-interest in utilitarianism, but there's at least a respect for not being able to ask others to self-sacrifice. Whereas in Kant, it's like everyone's here to be a lamb on the slaughter. Um, it's pretty tough, actually. But I think he's right. Sometimes. Like I said, all these perspectives, they make sense. And I understand that I'm not seeing all these, you know, everything from each perspective. Um, and what makes sense in different perspectives and in different moments, we still can't universalize. So it's consistent with what I was saying before. I just don't take this as evidentiary that the other stuff that makes sense to me is wrong. Which Kant would. Kant would use this to disagree with other stuff, but the perspectivism of like Spinoza and Benjamin and historical affective eidetics requires that I hold open space for my ignorances. So, what is the purpose of reason then? It's to suffer in order to produce a goodwill. It limits prejudices, quibbling with reasons, from quibbling with reasons edicts. I think that's something Kant says, and it cultivates a goodwill. We'll see that in the text in a minute. Um, what is duty? Duty is he presents four case studies, and only the fourth one is true duty, duty with any worth. The first one is I'm kind of loose on these, but I think the first one is just actions that aren't good or dutiful or universal law at all. The second one is actions that are dutiful or good, but they're forced by external constraints, like being made to pay your taxes or made to appear in court or something like that. Or like you're going to be punished if you like the only reason you don't kill somebody is because you don't want to be killed yourself or go to jail. Like that's the second case, external constraints. Third case is the confelicity that we talked about, where you benefit from helping them. You actually love them. He like literally says you're of such a charitable nature that you just enjoy naturally other people's being well for their own sake, which is what I really resonate with. Um, he says that's not dutiful either. The dutiful person who is the one who is like depressed, kind of is he's describing depression in some way. He says they're detached from their normal ability to care about other people. And despite that, they still go out of their way to do what the right thing to do is and to help others with their capacities. And that alone is dutiful. And then he gives another example that's in the fourth case. Um, but they have to be almost against, it has to actually cause some kind of self-harm um, for it to be a clear case of duty that has no other possible way of being motivated besides a goodwill, besides good in itself, just good intention. Um, so it's right lawful action from a goodwill against inclination or desire. Not just like it has to be against inclination or desire. It can't provide satisfaction. It's not from ego, and it can't produce arrogance or moral superiority. You can't do it because you don't want to be, quote, like them or something like that. There's no othering. There's no um, prejudicing of it. That would be a major, that would not be duty at all. That would not be a goodwill. That would be disgusting. What is respect? We already talked about that. But again, um, respect is the worth of duty. If you don't get ego or energy or arrogance. Remember, energy is something that you might pragmatically have justification for beliefs, um, might give you pragmatic justification for beliefs. Like for William James, if believing in God gives you more energy in the morning to get up and help other people, then it's a worthwhile belief. And that's a utilitarian conception. So it really does go against Kant. James says that he's kind of, I don't know if he says it. He's described in the introduction as being kind of utilitarian by, forget the person's name, and I don't want to misquote it. But we'll have an episode on James. We'll have a series. I'll probably do the sentiment of rationality isn't assigned, but I'll probably do that too because I like it. Um, so yeah, I guess, maybe you learn what respect is from doing these kinds of duties, but then you still are a posteriori determining what respect is. And there are moments where you really need to go from, we need to have that a priori necessity. The preface is where he explains a priori versus a posteriori, so that's why it's assigned. And then the first section is where he moves through goodwill, reason, duty, respect, categorical imperative. He only gets to the first one, the first categorical imperative. But if respect is feeling our consciousness becoming more ordered, um, well, he finds a way of saying that involves the my own adherence to the universal laws of nature and reason, which are still a priori. And because they're a priori, we can't reference like the law of the land or any kind of law. So he says, what kind of law would this be? Law as such. He says law as such. Well, he also says respect is neither a fear nor an inclination. So it's neither running or chasing, like running away from or running to something. So it's really interesting here that those are kind of the foundations of Buddhism as well. That there are three kleshas in Buddhism, or three mind poisons. The first one is chasing. Well, I think the first and second are interchangeable. The first two are chasing and running, desire and fear, um, sensuous pleasure, like indulging in pleasure and avoiding pain instead of taking the path with the ups and downs as it comes, taking joy and suffering as the path. And then the third klesha is wrong understanding. So even if you're doing all those things, if you're still not finding a way to enjoy the strawberry, despite the tiger in front of you and the tiger behind you, um, then that's the other mind poison. So it's really cool that Kant has a parallel here where respect really actually lines up with like Buddhist enlightenment. It lines up with if you respect yourself, you're going to understand your mortality and appreciate your life. Um, and respect others and appreciate their mortality and appreciate their life. So that's the fear and desire thing, that's in a footnote, which we will also read. Um, and so what do you respect? What can we respect? What can be the object of respect? Well, he also says in the footnote that we can't respect ourselves and we can't respect others. So that's why self-respect with Didion is not quite lining up with Kant. Because when we respect ourselves, we only respect ourselves as a representative of the law, meaning we can only respect the law as such. But we embody that by respecting each of our embodiments of the law. Um, and so again, then how do we respect the law? What law would we respect? What is law as such? Well, the answer to that is law as such. And then what is law as such? Law itself. Lawness, lawfulness. What is lawfulness? Lawfulness is being of a constitution where you consistently, or you're a consistent kind of person. You follow laws of behavior to some extent. Um, Now it's not ritualistic. Doesn't have to be. It's absolutely not dogmatic. Kant is explicitly anti-dogmatic. He says that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. And that was the start of the Critique of Pure Reason, or I think it was in that era. Or what led him, I think that was what led him to write the critique. So lawfulness, universalizability, right? Um, anything because in the state of goodwill or a priori, I still take action. I just cannot reference the outcome of the action. But I have to be willing in doing things. So what do I will and do? I will and do things that are good. Well, how can they be good? They're good if they're respectful. They're good if they're dutiful. What does any of that mean without an outside world? Again, it means that I would want other people to follow the same rules. Now, the maxim part is important because it's not legalistic. It's not necessarily hyper formal. Um, the maxim is the principle of the action. I mean, I'm not sure that anybody has said this yet, but I think two people with two different characters or two different histories would take the same maxim in different directions. Um, because I think there might be some interpretive components to the maxim or some combinatoric components to the maxim. Ultimately, you want to come to a moral system that prevents anyone from getting hurt ever, but that's also not how human bodies work. Um, and I think a lot of times we're seeing recent harm from like techno-futurists who want to prolong the life of the body, whether it's AI consciousness or robotics or uh, neural implants. Like it's all kind of just grief worthy. It's sad. It's sad because it's all a denial of grief. It's not going to pan. Um, I mentioned that because the maxim, following universal maxims may not fix everything. It may not be possible to fix everything. It may not be possible to prevent every bad outcome. Um, but at least the maxims make sense. When we get to utilitarianism, I don't want to get as confused, but utilitarianism looks at the consequences. Act utilitarianism actually calculates the consequences. And so it can break rules if those particular consequences mathematically outweigh the suffering on a big scale, on a wide impact scale. But the person that we're going to read is like the second utilitarian. John Stuart Mill came after the founder. The founder was mostly Jeremy Bentham, who was also a politician and a lawmaker. And so he's really making utilitarianism for governmental administration and economic decision making. Getting ahead of ourselves. Anyway, acting as if the maximum of your action could become a universal law is still really similar actually to what utilitarians do in John Stuart Mill, because they do the rule utilitarians, which Mill was, sought to follow general rules of conduct and behavior that were good for society, which is very similar to like the ground for why um, you want people to be consistent and you want people to follow the same principles of moral behavior, the same maxims in their actions. Maxim is just like the principle of an action, right? An action can't have quite um, it's not linguistic or it's not formally linguistic. It is communicative, whether Kant acknowledges that or not. An action is communicative and transformative of the world. And uh, and so the maxim is the kind of essence. It's the essence of the action, where the principle is the essence of a claim or a theory or a sentence. Okay, from universalizability, that's the law that is already in nature. So that's the second natural law, or that's the second formulation of the categorical imperative. The first is that we universalize whatever is a priori. The second is that that's already what nature does. The third is that everybody would come to the same conclusions independently, doing the same thing. And that's why reason autonomously comes to universal conclusions. Each of our reason is independent, and it's autonomous because it's self-determining, not just because it's what we would come to independently, but because it determines of itself consistent truths that we each determine of ourselves. Fourth formulation is that we would never want to be treated as a means instead of an end. So means and ends are the last question in our guiding questions. And means are methods or tools or instruments. And ends are goals or purposes or objectives or reasons, satisfactions, culminations, completions, etc. Happinesses. If you think that a happiness is an intrinsic good, so intrinsic goods are also ends. But they're sort of there's a flow through time, and the end is the terminus of the means. It's the end point of the means. And ends can become means for other ends. And this is why it's important to talk about like intrinsic goods versus instrumental goods, because some ends or goals are still only instrumental goods for other ends. Like the end of getting a good grade in a class is an instrumental good if you're just caring about the grade. It's an instrumental good for um, getting your degree at the end of the multi-year college process, university process. You can also consider education to be an intrinsic good. It wouldn't be so much about getting a good grade as it would be about learning the material and exploring your research interests. And then even if you got a bad grade, you wouldn't mind that much because you accomplished what your goals were, because they were intrinsic, not instrumental. They were good in themselves. They were worthwhile. Um, all right, so you always want to be treated and respected as if you are like an end in itself. Um, So whereas not all ends are ends in themselves, the ones that are intrinsic goods are ends in themselves. They are not instrumental. They're not also means for something else. Or if they are means for something, let me rephrase that. They can be means for something else, but they do not need to be means for something else for them to be full stop self-justifying. And if there is an end in itself, it's not like, I mean, I am worthwhile in myself, but I'm also a means to teaching other people. I'm useful and helpful to teaching other people. um, those things are not mutually exclusive. I'm still an end to myself. And and you guys are ends in yourselves too, and you want to be treated that way. You want to be respected that way. And you would feel disrespected if you thought somebody did not see you as a human. And this is all consonant with the what we've already said about respect, where it is um, you probably wouldn't feel disrespected if you don't see people that way. If you don't see people that way and somebody else sees you as like inhuman, you also probably don't see yourself as human. Um, it's only when there's that mismatch between what you said is your universal standard and what you're getting and what you're giving that you feel unjustified. Kant doesn't say all this stuff. I'm just um, having insights as we discuss. The final one is a kingdom of ends. So if everybody is following the universal laws of reason, everybody is rational, self-regulative, treating each other as ends in themselves at all moments, working together as much as necessary, but not too much, democratically determining um, what the standards for group labors are, and because that's ultimately what democracy and communism are going for, is democratic control of the workplace instead of hierarchies where bosses or managers control, um, and classrooms too. This is decolonial thought, decolonial pedagogy, and decolonial labor. So yeah, if everybody is working like that, we get the kingdom of ends, which is what Kant thought was basically heaven on earth. Um, it's a pure realm where everybody's a good person, like an angel, saint, and we all treat each other like that. And things are good because of it, because we're all enlightened. And that's how it connects with enlightenment too. So what I think we'll do here is just do the preface, and then on the next episode we can jump into for the first section. Ancient ancient Greek philosophy was divided into three sciences: physics, ethics, and logic. This division is perfectly suitable to the nature of the subject, and the only improvement that can be made in it is perhaps only to supply its principle, so that there will be a possibility on the one hand of ensuring its completeness, and on the other of correctly determining its necessary subdivisions. All rational knowledge is either material and concerned with some object, or it is formal and concerned only with the form of understanding and of reason themselves, and with the universal rules of thought in general, without regard to differences of its objects. Formal philosophy, this latter category, is called logic. Material philosophy, however, has to do with determinate objects and with the laws to which these parts are subject. And such philosophy is divided into two parts, because these laws are either laws of nature or laws of freedom. The science of the former is called physics, while that of the latter is called ethics. They are also called doctrine of nature and doctrine of morals, respectively. Logic cannot have any empirical part, i.e., a part in which the universal and necessary laws of thought would be based on grounds taken from experience. For in that case, it would not be logic, i.e., a canon for understanding, and reason, which is valid for all thinking and which has to be demonstrated. Natural and moral philosophy, on the contrary, can each have an empirical part. The former has to, because it must determine the laws of nature as an object of experience, and the latter because it must determine the will of man insofar as the will is affected by nature. So the laws of the former are those according to which everything does happen, while the laws of the latter are those according to which everything ought to happen, although these moral laws also consider the conditions under which what ought to happen frequently does not. All philosophy, insofar as it is founded on experience, may be called empirical, while that which sets forth its doctrines is founded entirely on a priori principles may be called pure. The latter, when merely formal, is called logic, but when limited to determinate objects of the understanding, it is called metaphysics. So when you determine a priori principles in relation to objects of the understanding, that's metaphysics instead of logic. If it's just forms about forms, that's logic. In this way, there arises the idea of a twofold metaphysics, a metaphysics of nature and a metaphysics of morals. The Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science was published a year later, 1786. The Metaphysics of Morals was published 12 years later, 1797, 7 years before he passed away. So you can see he was working on all these things at the same time. Back and forth between physics and ethics, natural philosophy, and in this way, physics will thus have its empirical part, but also a rational one. Ethics will too, though here the empirical part might more specifically be called practical anthropology, while the rational part might properly be called morals. All industries, crafts, and arts have gained by the division of labor, viz., which means regarding, one man does not do everything, but each confines himself to a certain kind of work that is distinguished from all other kinds by the treatment it requires. So the work may be done with the highest perfection and with greater ease. Where work is not so distinguished and divided, where everyone is a jack of all trades, their industry remains sunk in the greatest barbarism. Whether or not pure philosophy in all its parts requires its own special man might well be in itself a subject worthy of consideration. Would not the whole of this learned industry be better off if those who are accustomed, as the public taste demands, to purvey a mixture of the empirical with the rational in all sorts of proportions, unknown even to themselves and who style themselves independent thinkers, while giving the name of hair splitters to those who apply themselves to the purely rational part, were to be given warning about pursuing simultaneously two jobs which are quite different in their technique, and each of which perhaps requires a special talent, that when combined with the other talent produces nothing but bungling? So do specialties get in the way of each other? But I only ask here whether the nature of science does not require that the empirical part always be carefully separated from the rational part, which was, in fact, Bergson's critique of analysis. Should not physics proper, i.e. empirical physics, is also Sartre's critique of non-phenomenology, be preceded by a metaphysics of nature and practical anthropology by a metaphysics of morals? Both of these metaphysics must be carefully purified of everything empirical in order to know how much pure reason can accomplish in each case and from what sources it draws its a priori teaching. Whether such teaching can be conducted, whether such teaching be conducted by all moralists, whose name is Legion, or only by some who feel a calling thereto. Since I am here primarily concerned with moral philosophy, the foregoing question will be limited to a consideration of whether or not there is the utmost necessity for working out for once a pure moral philosophy that is wholly cleared of everything which can only be empirical and can only belong to anthropology. So this is why he's doing that grounding that's separate from empirical evidence, supposedly. That there must be such a philosophy is evident from the common idea of duty and of moral laws. Everyone must admit that if a law is to be morally valid, i.e., is to be valid as a ground of obligation, then it must carry with it absolute necessity. He must admit that the command, "Thou shalt not lie," does not hold only for men, as if other rational beings had no need to abide by it. And so with all the other moral laws properly so called, and he must concede that the ground of obligation here must therefore be sought not in the nature of man, nor in the circumstances of the world in which man is placed, but must be sought a priori solely in the concepts of pure reason. He must grant that every other precept which is founded on principles of mere experience, even a precept that may in certain respects be universal, insofar as it rests in the least on empirical grounds, perhaps only in its motive, can indeed be called a practical rule but never a moral law. Thus, not only are moral laws, together with their principles, essentially different from every kind of practical cognition in which there is anything empirical, but all moral philosophy rests entirely on its pure part. When applied to man, it does not in the least borrow from acquaintance with him, anthropology, but gives a priori laws to him as a rational being. To be sure, these laws require furthermore a power of judgment, sharpened by experience, partly in order to distinguish in what cases they are applicable, and partly to gain for them access to the human will, as well as influence for putting them into practice. So, in fact, this is kind of what I was critiquing Kant about for, and he's getting ahead of it a little bit, and I respect that. He is saying that his a priori arguments depend on some kind of experience or the power of judgment sharpened by experience. For man is affected by so many inclinations that, even though he is indeed capable of the idea of a pure practical reason, he is not so easily able to make that idea effective in concreto in the conduct of his life. Kant also says that what he writes down here is not anything new, but is In fact, the moral law that everyone has been following for like the 2,000 years before, or the 4,000, 6,000, however many years humans have been around. I'm not a young Earth creationist. I'm sorry for saying 2,000 years. Um, all of human history. A metaphysics of morals is thus indispensably necessary, not merely because of motives of speculation regarding the source of practical principles, which are present a priori in our reason, but because morals themselves are liable to all kinds of corruption, as long as the guide and supreme norm for correctly estimating them are missing. So we need like a fallback for determining conflicts. For in the case of what is to be morally good, that it conforms to the moral law is not enough. It must also be done for the sake of the moral law. And it has to be self-aware. So not just to determine conflicts, but also so there's the respect that comes from doing it for the right intention for itself. Otherwise, that conformity is only very contingent and uncertain, since the non-moral ground may now and then produce actions that conform with the law, but quite often produces actions that are contrary to the law. Kant here uses law in terms of autonomous, universal, categorical imperative. Reason, not the law is written in some country. We saw that in the answer to the question, what is enlightenment, where he says that you can overthrow any unjust law. You don't have to follow a law that says you can't criticize the law. Specifically, he says that. Now, the moral law in its purity, and there he goes, the moral law. The moral law in its, and he talked about the physical law, in its purity and genuineness, which is of the utmost concern in the practical realm, can be sought nowhere but in a pure philosophy. Therefore, pure philosophy or metaphysics must proceed. Without it, there can be no moral philosophy at all. That philosophy which mixes pure principles with empirical ones does not deserve the name of philosophy. For philosophy is distinguished from ordinary rational knowledge by its treatment in a separate science of what the latter comprehends only confusedly. Still less does it deserve the name of moral philosophy, since by this very confusion it spoils even the purity of morals and counteracts its own end. There must be no thought that what is required here is already contained in the propedeutic that precedes the celebrated Wolff's moral philosophy, i.e., in what he calls universal practical philosophy, and that hence there is no need to break entirely new ground. Just because his work was to be a universal practical philosophy, it has not taken into consideration any special kind of will, such as one determined solely by a priori principles, without any empirical motives, and which could be called a pure will, but is considered volition in general, together with all the actions and conditions belonging to it under the general signification. And thereby does his propedeutic differ from a metaphysics of morals in the same way that general logic, which expounds the acts and rules of thinking in general, differs from transcendental philosophy, which treats merely of the particular acts and rules of pure thinking, i.e., of that thinking whereby objects are cognized completely a priori. For the metaphysics of morals has to investigate the idea and principles of a possible pure will, and not the actions and conditions of human volition as such, which are for the most part drawn from psychology. Moral laws and duty are discussed in this universal practical philosophy, though quite improperly, but this is no objection to what has been said about such philosophy. For the authors of this science remain true to their idea of it on the following point also. They do not distinguish the motives which as such are presented completely a priori by reason alone and are properly moral from the empirical motives which the understanding raises to general concepts merely by the comparison of experiences. So he's claiming that the a priori claims in his argument truly do not rest on experience, where I've said they do, or they suspiciously seem to, like the case study of duty and respect. It's just a comparative state. Without reference to outside world, it's just a comparative state. or without it's hard to like really say what your ideas you could work with as a child without this world and come to the same argument. Rather, they consider motives irrespective of any difference in their source, and inasmuch as they regard all motives as being homogeneous, they consider nothing but their relative strength or weakness. In this way, they frame their concept of obligation, which is certainly not moral, but is all that can be expected from a philosophy which never decides regarding the origin of all possible practical concepts, whether they are a priori or merely a posteriori. I intend someday to publish a Metaphysics of Morals, but as a preliminary to that, I now issue this grounding. Indeed, and this is 1785, indeed, there is properly no other foundation for such a metaphysics than a critical examination of pure practical reason, just as there is properly no other foundation for a metaphysics of nature than the critical examination of pure speculative reason, which has already been published. So that was the critique of pure reason, where he looked at the categories of the mind and the preconditions of experience to say something about the world. But in the first place, the former critique is not so absolutely necessary as the latter one, because human reason can, even in the most ordinary mind, be easily brought in moral matters to a high degree of correctness and precision, while on the other hand, in its theoretical but pure use, it is wholly dialectical. So he's saying, this is where he's going to say that people have already been following these rules and they already know them. In the second place, if a critical examination of pure practical reason is to be complete, then there must, in my view, be the possibility at the same time of showing the unity of practical and speculative reason in a common principle. For in the final analysis, there can be only one and the same reason, which is to be differentiated solely in its application. But without introducing considerations of an entirely different kind, and without thereby confusing the reader. But there is no possibility here of bringing my work to such completeness where you would unify the present grounding for the metaphysics of morals with the grounding for the metaphysics of nature, because that would be a massive undertaking at this stage in trying to explain it to us. Without introducing considerations of an entirely different kind and without thereby confusing the reader. Instead of calling the present work a critique of pure practical reason, I have therefore adopted the title Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. But in the third place, since a metaphysics of morals, despite the forbidding title, is nevertheless capable of a high degree of popularity and adaptation to the ordinary understanding, I find it useful to separate from the aforementioned metaphysics this preliminary work on its foundation, in order later to have no need to introduce unavoidable subtleties into doctrines that are easier to grasp. The present grounding is, however, intended for nothing more than seeking out and establishing the supreme principle of morality. This constitutes by itself a task which is complete in its purpose and should be kept separate from every other moral inquiry. The application of this supreme principle to the whole ethical system would, to be sure, shed much light on my conclusions regarding this central question, which is important, but has not heretofore been at all satisfactorily discussed, and the adequacy manifested by the principle throughout such application would provide strong confirmation for the principle. Nevertheless, I must forego this advantage, which after all would be more gratifying for myself than helpful for others, since ease of use and apparent adequacy of a principle do not provide any certain proof of its soundness, but do awaken rather a certain bias which prevents any rigorous examination and estimation of it for itself without any regard to its consequences. He's almost saying that accessibility of an idea makes it reduces the effort required, and then the person doesn't understand it as well because they haven't grappled with it in the way that they need to develop an understanding of it, to build an understanding of it, to construct it, which is a constructivistic theory of learning. The method adopted in this work is, I believe, one that is most suitable if we proceed analytically from ordinary knowledge to a determination of the supreme principle, and then back again synthetically from an examination of this principle and its sources to ordinary knowledge where its application is found. Therefore, the division turns out to be the following. And this is the division for the grounding of the metaphysics of morals, but we're only going to read the first section after this. I'm sure one day I'll come back and do the second and third sections, but I haven't studied them and I probably don't understand them yet. And I don't have time at this point with my semester schedule and the things I'm expecting to do next semester to figure that out. So, first section, transition from the ordinary rational knowledge of morality to the philosophical. And that's enough to get us from first philosophy eidetics into the categorical imperative. And then after that second section, transition from popular moral philosophy to a metaphysics of morals. Third section, final step from a metaphysics of morals to a critique of pure practical reason. And that's where we would go from all of the necessary details about morality in the world into the transcendental necessities required by the mind. Transcendental means that the givenness in the world is the consequence of some cause that is behind the curtain of reality. And so we can do something about the necessary structure of the mind that makes possible these experiences. And so a critique in Kant's sense is not like an evisceration or a negative polemics. It's not taking down some person you disagree with. A critique in Kant's sense is to lay out whatever preconditions must be necessary in order for the current state of affairs to be true or possible. And they are still true and possible because they are actual. So what is necessary for them to be actual? That's the transcendental method of arguing. And that's the end of the preface too. So that was a lot. These lectures do take a lot out of me, more than I expected, really, because they don't when I'm pacing them out over the semester. It's October. It's my first October in my 30s, and it's getting chilly, which I like. And there are bugs, and I have some wood that I got for free from a friend that I'm looking forward to burning when it gets really cold, maybe like a little campfire. Have some friends over when I do it. Um, and I had a bug in my house last week, and it really freaked me out because it was a giant cockroach. So I've had my AC really, really cold, trying to make it miserable for them. Apparently, cockroach is like 77 to 86 degrees, something I quickly Googled. Um, so I've got it really cold in here. I don't want any cockroaches. Ah, freaked me out. A panic attack for like 2 days straight. Come on, Winchester. You want to come here? Come on. He was laying down. Come on. Come on. Get down. Come on. Get it. Go get it. All right, that was the tax. You guys saw the dog getting the toy. Okay. Take care of yourselves. Let me know if you need anything, and be well and be kind and be good. Bye. We'll read the first section in the next video. Looks like it's only 10 pages. I don't know if I finished it. Hopefully I got everything that we need. Yeah. So I think that'll only take one video. We've already covered all the ideas in it. All right, see you soon.